Hi everyone, welcome to Jan 9, 2024 SIG Node weekly meeting. Happy New Year. So the first item on the agenda is the C group aware killer configuration that we discussed before the break. And Peter, you are raising it. Can anyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was wondering if anyone wanted to take this on, and if we should work on it at 1:30. I'd be willing to volunteer, but I'd also be happy to defer to someone else if they wanted to.
Okay. I guess Todd introduced that one, so maybe we can ask Todd if he's willing to take that forward.
Yeah, I was planning on doing it and just haven't had time, unfortunately.
Perfect. If you want help with drafting up the KEP or anything, I'm happy to help.
I'm sorry, with help with what part of it?
Drafting up a KEP or anything. I mean, any part of it. I'm happy to help with it.
For the change. Yeah, I could. I guess, do we need a KEP for adding a kubelet config option? Probably so.
Yeah, it's kind of a murky area. I think I have been asked to make one before, but also we might be able to get away with not doing one. I'm not sure.
I'm leaning towards not needing one. I'm not sure. Derek, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you, Manol. I don't think we need one.
Okay. All right.
All right.
We have a plan. Thanks, folks. Let's move on to the next one. So Kevin, added ImageFS nodes and default eviction hard. So there's a PR that you wanted.
This is just, I noticed that in our default, it's for the eviction manager, we actually don't have anything for inodes for ImageFS, and it's probably a very minor bug because I don't know how many people are actually like that. What you could get into this case if you mounted a file system to the default location where containers live, and then effectively the eviction manager won't be looking at the inodes of an ImageFS. So the fix is just adding a line to have the ImageFS inodes free, just looking for an improver. And then I was also curious about whether or not this is something we should cherry pick back to some of the supported Kubernetes versions that we have.
It's just changing the defaults.
Yeah, just adding an ImageFS inodes free default. It wasn't there before.
Maybe put it in chat.
Yeah, I mean, it seems okay to do to both. I can't think of a downside, if that makes sense. Like, you're either gonna exhaust your system or you're not. And so you're not, and I don't know how many times users were configuring eviction parameters on their own, but it seems like this was a gap in the default that seems appropriate to fix.
Okay.
Right.
All right, I will get it improved, and then I can cherry pick those to the releases that we have.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yep.
So Rodrigo, you're up next regarding user namespace beta. You're on mute, Rodrigo.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, I was saying, we would like to talk about migrating the feature to beta. And yeah, maybe for 1:30, if everyone thinks it's fine. What we have, what we would like to solve before the beta migration is to configure the range the kubelet we use for the pods. Right now it's kind of hard-coded. And we created a proof of concept with Giuseppe, like just using the get sub ID binary. Like this works fine with etc sub UID or free API and everything if it's more centralized and it doesn't have any dependency, just if the binary exists and it works, we use it. Otherwise, we fall back to a reasonable default. That is what we have now. And then we'll need two more things. That is a review of the KEP from the VM runtime people, like so runtimes that use VMs, so like Firecracker or Kata or something, to review these. I think we will need some help to gather the attention of the right people there.
What's the intersect there? Like, I'm assuming it doesn't matter, or the plan is to wrap it around a user namespace on the host or within the VM?
My assumption is it doesn't matter, because when you run a containers using namespaces, you want the user namespace to isolate the user from the container, from the user in the host. But when you run inside a VM, those are naturally isolated.
Right.
So
Yeah. Should it be ignored in the VM runtimes entirely? Yes.
yeah, it could be ignored, or they can configure it inside the VM to have greater isolation in the case of a VM compromise. But in any case, it seems that only some file system will need some kernel support, but it's just a matter of that. Like it doesn't seem to be anything, but it's something that we listed in the KEP checklist to have for the beta migration.
Yep.
But yeah.
Another thing that comes to mind is like getting enough feedback. So I worry when we move things to beta and then people start using it and then we find issues. So how do we solve that? Maybe we reach out to folks that are using it and give us feedback.
Yeah, so several people have reached out and gave feedback, and it was mostly encouraging, and it was more use than I expected. And yeah, I think this is present in Cryo since 125, and the latest feature since 127. So we're getting some exposure with Cryo on the container design side. The things are merged for Containerd 2.0, but there is no Containerd 2.0 release yet, and it's not clear when it will be. So I think using Cryo as the user base is fine, but I don't know if people prefer to wait for a Containerd release. We can also do that and just start adding all the things that we need and wait in alpha.
My queue popped up. Do you have any thoughts on the Containerd support?
We're currently tracking to mid to late February.
Mid to late February for the 2.0 release?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what's the alpha support like? Is anyone using a Containerd version which has alpha support, or this will be the first version?
No. We got some feedback from people using Containerd 1.7 that was released March last year that has support for all of these. But yeah, mostly like most of the issues were around documentation, that it wasn't clear that with Containerd 1.6 it didn't work or things like that. But it was everything was quite easy to solve, or we improved some error messages or some feature that wasn't namespace aware, but yeah, nothing hard to track down, or more than a few lines.
Right. I think we can update the announcement, and I would put feedback as an explicit item, and then we see if we get enough that we feel confident to move to beta. The other items all seem fair to add. And if we can think of any additional E2E tests that we could benefit from.
Oh yeah, sure. We have some, but yeah, there's always room for more. So, and there's one item that is listed on the beta migration today that is plan on enable it by default. I think what I would say is like the feature gate will be on by default at least after one release in beta. So it won't be on by default when it's beta. And like the feature in the pod, but like if a pod doesn't specify to use user namespaces, I wouldn't take that by default as meaning take a user namespace. So change default for at least, I don't know, several releases after GA. So I think that sounds fine, right? As how to proceed with that item.
I,
It seems
So-
fair. We just need to make sure we've got a refresh pack out if we need it in the runtimes, et cetera. Right?
We get a refresh what?
Well, if we have any issues that we need to, ship a refresh pack or whatever, 2.1 or it's, that sort of thing. Or a 201, right?
Yeah.
That's all.
Sure.
Just need to check, run the test cases, the new buckets.
Yeah.
So I would suggest updating the enhancement, Rodrigo, and we can take it from there.
So like open APR,
Yeah,
putting like for the cap and asking for review or
Yeah.
for more feedback or something like that.
yeah, I think just merging the KEP and then update to beta. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. And wait, one more question. So regarding the VM runtime review, shall I just discard that point or?
It may be worth chatting with VM runtime folks and see what they think about it. Maybe
Okay.
maybe join a Kata community meeting or something.
Okay. Perfect.
If there are folks from AWS, if they can connect us to Firecracker folks, that'll be useful too.
Perfect. I think that is all for me.
Right. Thanks, Rodrigo.
No, thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Tim with kubelet config cleanup. We can't hear you. No.
How about now?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, you can hear me now? But
Yes.
I can hear you now. 1 second. Sorry, maybe come back to me and I'll see if I can debug my audio.
All right. Let's move on to the next one and we'll come back to Tim. So the next one, I believe, is from Radostin regarding checkpoint restore.
Yes. Hello everyone. Hey.
Hey.
Yeah, just want to check if essentially if you have any recommendations on how to move forward with essentially the KEP for forensic checkpointing. So there is one pull request that is adding additional use cases, Adrian's pull request, and it pretty much just describes additional use cases for checkpoint restore. The other pull request is for moving this feature from alpha to beta, and it's also introducing the command line interface for kubectl. And I was wondering if you have any feedback or recommendations on how we can move this forward.
I think we can definitely start with reviewing the use cases. The kubectl would be a huge jump, right? Because that would mean adding it to the API. And initially, when we introduced it, the idea was to restrict it to the kubelet API. The last conversation I think we had on this topic was around GC support and whether it should be done in the kubelet or in a standalone operator. And I think the consensus was to better have it outside the kubelet. And one more issue is, does it make sense to move this to beta without any sort of restore support? So how?
So we currently
Yeah.
have restore support. So the way restore currently works is if you create a checkpoint archive, then you can convert this archive into a container image. And then if you start a container from this container image, the container runtime, in this case Cryo, will essentially identify that this is a checkpoint based on annotation in the image, and then it will restore the container.
Okay.
So this is our, yeah.
So I think one question I had was like, the way we are doing it, is it standardized? And Mike, I know there were some concerns on the container D side. So are we all in agreement on how these images are stored in a registry and how they are run from the runtime?
We have a ticket or GitHub issue for if you can standardize essentially the set of annotations and the image that is being created by container engines. And there was some discussions on GitHub, but we haven't. I don't think there is a consensus yet on what is the best way to do that.
No, is the open container suggestions to get us back
Yes.
up. Yeah. So I think, Renal, I think we need possibly a security review around the process, as well as some kind of agreement on what the packaging would be for a checkpoint versus an image, right?
Right. Yep.
If there are any rules that we need to adhere to based on some kind of a security policy proposal, might be interesting. I like your idea of using an external tool for the garbage collection, or whatever that tool is that will own that process. But still, when it gets restored, can it be restored in another node? And how are we going to tell Kubelet, hey, here's a new container that you started on some other node?
Yeah. So
We're restoring here. How does that process work?
Yeah, I think Derek also has a question regarding that in chat. Maybe I think if you can shed some more light to understand like how the restore works. Like, are we able to create a new pod YAML with a container pointing to the checkpointed image in the registry?
And that's where it's sort of at a funny state, because it doesn't know how to checkpoint pods yet. There's no context of that, right? It can only do
right. What happens to pod level metadata and what happens to volumes and so on. Yeah.
I think the use cases are interesting and important. We just have to figure out what does it mean in the context of pods, I think.
Okay.
And we need a security review on it. I would like to see.
Thank you, Mike. This is very helpful.
Sure.
Derek, do you think it would make sense to see a demo of the flow here?
I think it'd be great to see just like the update on the current state, so we're all on the same page. And then personally, I don't know if I care about restoring the pod in a Kubernetes context, like in all use cases. And then I can definitely see some use cases where I would want to run the pod in a different cluster than the one where I did the action, particularly if I was doing some type of threat analysis. So don't take my comment around restore as being prohibitive in any way. Like, I think checkpoint and looking at what's there is valuable, even if you never get restore. But a demo.
Yeah, I think for the debug case, I think you're right, Derek, for the debug case. I think
Yeah, like if I think I'm a victim of some type of attack, I want to checkpoint the system state and then investigate that process somewhere else. And having
Yeah.
that flow understood seems great. It's not clear for the other use cases that I know that were envisioned there around, like, I don't know, GPU computations and that type of stuff. That one seems a little more complicated to reason through, where then pod lifecycling seems important. But yeah, anyway, the demo sounds great if we can arrange that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Derek.
that's what I was sort of saying, Derek. It doesn't make sense if the containers are using shared namespaces and we're only storing the one container. Or we're not sharing the shared information. Then it's sort of confusing.
I think maybe Radisson, let's organize a demo in the upcoming meetings, and that'll help. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will speak with Andrew and see if we can organize them.
Yeah, and also, can you share links to the discussions around standardizing the annotations and paste them in the meeting notes so we can take a look at it? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I will do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
I think I got my audio working, if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you, Tim. Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so I'm hoping to get more involved in SIG Node again this year. And so it was kind of like looking to ramp back up on some kubelet tasks, and wanted to pick up some kind of cleanup work. And something that stood out to me was the state of kubelet configuration. It seems like it's kind of spread across a number of different packages. Looks like there's multiple sources of truth for a lot of the configuration values. Yeah, so I don't have a concrete proposal at the moment. I just kind of wanted to give an FYI that I'm going to be digging into this. And the one question that I had was, there's still a lot of values that are only set by flags and not through the kubelet configuration API. If I remember correctly, I think those weren't originally added to the API because with dynamic kubelet configuration, we didn't want to expose some settings through the API level. I'm wondering if now that we've deprecated and removed dynamic kubelet configuration, if it would be reasonable to add the remaining flags into the API configuration object so that the majority of the kubelet configuration can be set through a config file rather than having to mix the config file and the flags.
Hey, Tim, my memory gels with yours on why flags and config were separated. The only other thing I think we should look through is if flags were safe to update without a drain versus just kubelet config being safe to update without a drain, or it's something like basically, do we require a drain or not on certain types of config changes? That'd be another thing to tease out. But
okay.
I think your memory is accurate and impressive. So and look forward to your help in exploring cleaning this up.
Tim, one thing you should be aware of is recently folks have been working on conf.d feature for specifying configuration. So that's,
okay.
Yeah.
I'll take a look for that as well.
Okay. Thanks and welcome back. So next we have Francisco. Francisco, are you on the call?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Do you need host to share anything? Or?
I can talk it through or show the couple slides I have, but both are fine.
Up to you. I'll just make you host.
Okay.
You
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me try to share them. What? Oh, very complex. Okay. Okay. Who's this one? And this one. And now slides should be showing. Okay, So what is this about? The elevator pitch of this proposal I'm going to talk about, stress on proposal, will be more clear later, is that when the kubelet determines conclusively that given the state of a pod, it could not, given the state of a node, it could run a given pod be admitted, it could trigger the unbinding and enable rescheduling of the same pod instance versus let the controller let it recreate a new instance and mark the pod being admitted as failed like we have today. Why could we DEP in this state in the first place? Because there are certain flow in the admission flow, and I'm sure about that can cause this admission, for example, that admission failure that other components are not aware of. The easiest example I'm most familiar with is NUM alignment issue, but this is not totally not the only case, as we emerged during the previous conversation. Will be more context in just a little while. And there are also possible runtime errors. For example, another example is device plugin that could be not ready, and we are exploring also interaction with CSI. Why we are exploring? Because this proposal is very fresh. Again, I will detail that in just a few moments. So, long story short, there are cases on which the kubelet could be the only one which could say, okay, there is no way this pod could run. In this case, we would like to enable a new scheduling attempt of the same instance. Okay, so where these come from? These come from conversation which I was not directly involved, but were later relayed on the batch working group on Slack channel during the KubeCon North America recently, last November, in the context of DRA, and it was later clarified that this proposal is not a blocker for better graduation of the array and further progress on the array. This is now evolving using another approach like more precise resource measurement, which is another effort entirely. But still, this feature is still deemed relevant for the array, like, okay, this could enable us in the future. And it's also solving another few quite clear problems, like, for example, the dreaded runaway pod creation, which is partially addressed by NUMA rescheduling. So this is the other bit, for example. And again, since this gathered quite some interest already in this, in this Slack conversation, we are also exploring other cases to say, okay, yes, this we could re-architect things a bit. But another question which is immediately coming to mind, do we have alternatives? For example, what about the scheduler? And from early feedback, okay, the scheduler is indeed, okay, obvious pick, but not a great fit unless we do possibly major changes, but in general, not a great fit because even we trigger the scheduler to make this happen, there is no provision to make sure that the scheduler doesn't pick again a bad in quotes node and trigger again this possible rejection loop. We will be having a race again with controllers, for example, the deployment controller, which, okay, in the current state, if the kubelet failed admission and say, okay, this pod could not run, the pod is failed, the controller kicks in, create a new instance, possibly hit the same node over and over again. This is exactly the runaway pod creation I was speaking about. And plus, there are a few other concerns like, okay, should the scheduler take care of pod which are not in steady state like running? Should be a third-party component deal with what essentially is a platform behavior which you don't like? But most notably, the biggest drawback of just using the scheduler is that, okay, even if we use the scheduler and we'll need some changes, that will not completely solve this issue. So what is this about? What are we doing right now? So me and few others, very, very helpful people, key people, we drafted very freshly just before the winter break a design document which outlines the proposal, and we are just at this stage and looking for idea feedback from the relevant SIGs, like, hey, yes, or maybe yes, or no way, and reaching out to the community, and depending on feedback, decide if we move forward, going as much as drafting a cap possibly for 130. I don't think we can make it, but depends on the feedback. Surely, if the feedback is positive, surely 131. And of course, draw a proof of concept. Now, I already presented this this concept to the last week SIG Node meeting and last week batch working group meeting. I'm doing again because in last week SIG Node meeting there was very limited audience, so was suggested, oh, let's do it again. So here we are. And in batch working group, a very good feedback that I want to make sure to relay because it was not in the slides is that yes, this could be nice. So could be explored that, but the overall feeling is that if we are solving this form of problem, there is possibly a hint of a larger issue that the scheduler and possibly the cluster doesn't have enough visibility about resource allocation, which I personally agree with, but it's a much larger effort, and for the moment I would be interested in the idea, go, no go feedback about this one proposal. All the links are in the notes, including these very slides and the design document I mentioned. And with that, I'm shutting up and waiting for comments. If someone is speaking, I'm not hearing anyone. But...
Okay, no one is speaking, so I'm gonna ask a question that's maybe obvious, but how
Okay.
will this affect the startup latency? Because we have an SLO since the pod is, I think, scheduled until the container is running.
Yes.
And if a pod can ping pong between different nodes, how do you see this affected? Or because it's not clear what the actual proposal is, or maybe this issue cannot happen. And sorry if that is the case.
In this case, my expectation, which of course would be needed to be validated and truly tested, is that the startup time should actually increase. Because if we hit the scenario on which the pod is scheduled against a bad, in quotes, node and could not run, there is no, basically it becomes pretty much a random. I don't see such a strong word, but yes, the scheduler could pick anything that could not be suitable. And then you could have a different form of ping pong on which the controller kicks in and says, okay, now I need to run another pod. The scheduler picks another random, in quotes. So for simple pods, it could it should converge with worse time. But the outcome which we are trying to prevent is the pod to run failed. And for pod managed by controllers, I expect it to improve. Of course, again, needs to be validated, but
yeah, but I mean, is there any upper limit on how much time it could take this ping pong on different nodes, or how to avoid nodes that were already tried by the scheduler, or is that into account in some way?
Yes. So what is part of the proposal, not explicitly mentioned in the slides for the sake of brevity, is that the discarded node will be kept in a list or in an object. We are discussing should be we're evaluating should be pod status, should be pod scheduling context created in the context of the dry enhancement or whatever, and this list should be upper bounded. So there will be a configurable upper limit of attempts, not which could be forever if the user says so, but we would like to set an upper bound for object size and for startup time, but also for object size reason, not having 100 of discarded nodes in those objects. So yes, there will be an upper bound, totally.
And then if you have a list of nodes that already failed,
yes,
and if the condition that made the pod startup failed on one node, for example, the port was already taken, would it be reevaluated if something changes on the node or not? Or
in a very nutshell, entries will have a TTL. Well, we will really like to have a TTL, details to be defined because the process is fresh. And should the pod fail to reach upper bound of tries, and then the pod will be set unshellable. And then when cluster condition changes, the node condition will be reevaluated, which is pretty much already being part of the standard scheduler flow. but it will be reviewed and enhanced to ensure that. So long story short, we don't want to get a node banned forever in this case.
Okay, makes sense. And sorry, one
couple
more
of-
question.
I'm sorry. I don't
Yeah,
know.
sure.
Just curious about why choosing these instead of making the scheduler aware of these features that forbid the proper scheduling of a pod into a node. Is it like why? I mean, I understand like it's simpler to have these, and making all the changes to other, it's probably more complicated. But is there any reasoning, or for which kind of changes using this should be fine, and for others the scheduler should be aware? Or
this is a very good feedback, and this is the other feedback I got from the batch working group, and the answer is yes, totally enhance the scheduler when the scheduler awareness, which is in turn pools the cluster awareness because the data structure could be reused. Absolutely. There are cases on which still the scheduler might fail, and this is in turn turns the case that we expect those failure, those retriggers to be exceptional, not like every pod is supposed to hit like one of them or 1 over 2 pods. So this should be an exceptional condition to be recovered. And yeah, totally enhance the cluster awareness and expose the information when it makes sense. Absolutely, absolutely. It's supposed to complete that. Yeah.
Yeah, and plus, so it might be some errors recoverable, which can be triggering the pod descheduling, which you cannot expose in the scheduler terms. Plus, like race conditions between the decision when scheduler make the node assignment and when the kubelet actually pick up the pod and tries to start it. So many things can change on the node. So scheduler can predict the error, but cannot mitigate it all the time.
Yeah, this is in oversimplified version. This is, you know, the like kind of the other half of fixing the scheduler problem, if that helps.
Francesca, so I had a question in the chat, and if you touched on this in the broader doc, I apologize, but
Yeah, sorry, I just didn't. Go on.
My recollection today is that we only have an RBAC permission for bind, but obviously there's no verb for unbind. And so it wasn't clear to me when I was reading through the doc if you were going to allow bind to pass the empty string, or would there be a new verb called unbind? And the second order effect of that question would be like, could you speak to like the security impact of having the kubelet having this permission? Like the obvious thing to me is that a node should only be able to unbind pods, not bind them, and only unbind those pods that are running on its node only. But are there is that an area you touched on or thought through, or can you speak to
that? Okay, shortly. Yes, those are the restrictions that we are considering, and I will be adding them to the document, and further clarified further and get review from the security people. But yes, the intention will be to limit the unbinding only by the kubelet for only the pods which were supposed to run on that kubelet, only when the pod, for example, is in pending stage. So yeah, to limit as much as possible, and by all means to not let the kubelet unbind pod which are running, for example. About creating a new verb or versus extending the bind, for example, to support empty string. At this point in time, disclaimer, because the proposal is still very fresh, the solution I will go for will be the one which is easiest to make secure.
Yeah,
which
I
don't know
have
yet.
A new verb because it would make RBAC easier to reason through in my mind, and keeps the action very scoped. Like you can't schedule, you can only unschedule.
Yeah, that will be my current train of thought as well. Yes.
Derek, if I remember correctly, right now on API server, this field is immutable once the pod is scheduled. So in simple description, yes, we can clear the node name from a pod, but most probably the implementation will be something more complex than that.
Yeah, in general, I'm not sure how we do this in a way that keeps backward compatibility. I was trying to think through, like, okay, pod phase, yeah, that was clear. It was going to be impending probably. I wasn't sure what all the pod conditions would work through. And then, yeah, those fields that today are immutable that would need to be made mutable. And in which API call paths that would have to happen, I think we would need broader feedback on. But I understand the spirit of the proposal.
Yeah.
You probably need to have something in the status and then lets the scheduler to reconsider and do an update of that field. Maybe.
Yeah. And the only other thought is that the slippery slope on this one would be like, I want to then grow this to do live migration of running pods from one node to the other. And that gets very tricky. And personally, I've always found it easier to reason about Kubernetes when a pod followed a well understood life cycle. It's very hard to reason about Kube sometimes. So like the way I could think in my head is, a pod is a mortal entity that has a defined life cycle, and once it's been homed, it's not moved. It's a simplifying way to reason about the system, and once we allow a pod to be able to move, it does introduce some complexity to reason through, and then that the jump between moving from the once you go into pending versus running state, I could see it getting harder and harder. So just maybe thoughts on that would be appreciated too.
Yeah,
Sure, I'm not one who sometimes feels like Kubernetes isn't always the easiest thing to follow, and where you have simple axioms, it's easier to make sure we don't make mistakes.
Would it be simpler? Sorry, you go, Alexander.
Derek, you pretty much like one-to-one repeating what Aldo initially said to that idea. He was saying like, let the pod fail, let the upper layer controllers recreate it, and let the scheduler to decide to start it somewhere else, and like once the pod is scheduled, get it as a final decision for the pod. But for me, it was actually a surprise what Aldo brought it back like a couple of months ago during the KubeCon discussions, that idea. So for some reason, scheduler guys changed their opinion.
Yeah, obviously, my opinion's just been grounded in, once I understood something, I didn't have to relearn something or think about edge cases around it in the last many years. So I understand the spirit of the argument. I can see how it is simplified if it was never started running. I just don't know how to chase through all the backward compatibility issues that I haven't reasoned through on that. But from a security standpoint, I would not like, I would want to make sure a kubelet doesn't grow powers on any other node, and any design should lead with that and speak to that restriction.
Very fair.
Keeping it to unbind and not growing broad scheduling powers, I think, is important.
Very fair, thanks. Okay, next action is on me to incorporate this feedback and to keep iterating. And I guess this means that we will need more time to evaluate those cases. And so basically, we will talk about again in 31 cycle, because I understand there are concerns because we are touching a very, very important, I would say. We are doing changes to pod life cycle, which is something we should not do lightly. So I will keep refining and possibly create a proof of concept. I guess my last question would be, would the proof of concept, how much will the proof of concept help? Because I would like to do that, but I'm worried about edge cases which I don't know, so I'm not sure we'll hit them. So would that help, or maybe there are other ways to clarify the things?
Like it'd be good to know if like any aspect of the node restriction plugin wouldn't
Mhm.
allow you to intercept like a pod bind or unbind action, you know,
Mhm.
those types of things. I mean, me personally, it's just keeping it as security restrictive first is like my first thought, and then finding edge cases on that would be informing, I guess. But then I think we need some other folks with their API reviewer hats on,
Okay.
just to even give advice on how to make a immutable mutable.
Okay, very fair. Thank you. Of course, there are more questions. Just hit me here, time allowing, or on Slack. Thanks for the very, very good feedback.
I would add regarding the proof of concept that you wanted to do, that usually that will help you to find several of the edge cases. Because when you start writing the code, you start to see all the cases that are possible. And in my experience, that was super helpful with the sidecars, KEP, or the user namespaces.
Absolutely.
So I think that will help.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you.
Right. Thanks for the discussion on that, folks. We are moving on to the last item on the agenda. Harshal, are you going to talk about this one?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep.
Yep. So this bug was filed by Joel Smith, and essentially, we discovered that even if you set the limits for ephemeral storage, the /dev is not taken into account, and the simple solution is essentially consider the /dev. So let me just give you a link which explains what the solution could be. However, Sergey had a concern. This was brought up in a SIG Node CI meeting last week. The concern is that if you start accounting for the devices or directories that were not accounted earlier while deciding the node pressure or disk pressure, which then it may lead to evictions sooner, right? And then that might have adverse effect on customers that are upgrading, because the earlier versions didn't anticipate that. The question here, the reason we brought it to SIG Node is how serious the SIG Node community thinks this concern is. Like, because the easiest solution is to send a PR to start accounting for dev directory apart from other directories that we already do. Or should it need more scrutiny, and the concern about backward compatibility is real, and we need a KEP, and we need to follow up with that, like KEP in a sense, keep this feature behind some flag, and only under that flag the /dev is considered for accounting. So that's the feedback I was looking for from the community.
I think one thing that's not clear to me is like what other files are we worried about under /dev. So this particular file, yes, it makes sense. Like we should look at it, but if we expand to all of /dev, what will actually be persistent there?
Yeah, you're right. This issue is specifically coming from /dev termination log, but we didn't go beyond that.
Yeah, so I think fixing that makes sense. Like I'm not worried about backwards compatibility because what's being shown in the demo looks like an abuse of it. Like how big a termination log should be, right? Maybe we have a limit for that.
Would it make sense if you just restrict to termination log of that particular file
Yeah, and maybe just do an audit and see if there's anything else that we are missing. I can't think of anything else off the top.
Okay, so even if we do that, you're saying that we may not warrant a cap or a specific option to enable this accounting?
That's what I'm thinking.
I would agree with Mernal. I think if it's just the termination log, adding it into the accounting is okay, and I wouldn't want a specific cap. To me, it's just it's consistent actually with the spirit on probably why the security group didn't label this as a CV, which was a lot of disk accounting associated with pods has been best effort. And I see this just as improving its accuracy.
Right. Thanks, Derek and Mrinal, for that feedback.
Right. Thanks. So that's the end of the agenda for today. Thanks, folks, for bringing all these topics. I think next week we can try to do a planning meeting for 1:30 because we'll soon run out of time. So I'll sync with Sergey and we'll plan to host that. Thanks. Have a good week, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.